Sophia Pitcher works in Masoretic studies, particularly focusing on the tamim, the accents. And she gave a couple of papers, one of them in the biblical Hebrew poetry section, where she was co-presenting with Emilu Grosser. And the other, she was presenting in the Masoretic studies section, and she was speaking alone at that point. And in both of the papers, she more or less gave us an overview and introduction to her very particularly linguistic way of looking at the ta'amim, the riddle of the ta'amim. And
tell the audience what ta'amim are. Let's assume people don't even know Hebrew, and what are the ta'amim?
Okay, so when you open a Hebrew Bible, you are faced with a whole sort of gamut of information on the page. First of all, you're faced. Let's say it's a Tiberian Bible Codex. You're faced with 3 columns of the biblical text, assuming it's one of the prose books. So, say Genesis through to 2 Kings or 2 Kings, whichever I meant to say, Nehemia. I remember from last time that.
No, it's fine.
Genesis.
No, I've since found out that it's a very British thing to say. 2 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians and 2 Kings. So that is something British do in general, I found out.
Okay, phew. Okay, good. So let's say it's one of those books. There are others in 3 columns as well, but let's just say it's one of those. And at the top and the bottom of the page of this Masoretic Codex, and in the margins of the 3 columns, you've got all of the Masoretic notes. We're not talking about those. We're talking about the biblical text itself. The biblical text itself is formed up of 3 different strands: the consonants, the consonantal text, and then a series of dots and dashes above and below those consonants, and sometimes in the middle of the consonants themselves, representing the vowels. But then, in addition, a whole nother set of lines and dots which represent the accents. So the vowels and the consonants are together sufficient for somebody just to read the biblical text. So, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, etc. I didn't need any accents there, except to know that haaretz was the end of the verse. So I guess I kind of did need an accent, sort of. But the accents are in the Tiberian Bible. They appear on every single word. And the big question, the question that has occupied scholars for centuries now, is what is their primary function? We know a cluster of their functions, but we're still really trying to pin down what is it at root that these accents do. I'll pause there in case somebody wants to respond, but I can carry on.
No, I mean, I'm riveted. Keep going, Kim.
So, we can list some of the things they do. Generally, the accent, as it appears on each word, will appear on the accented syllable of each word. So, melech, king, is accented at the beginning of the word. But if I take the same consonants and put in some different vowels, malach, he ruled, then you can hear that the stress is at the end of the word. So usually, not always, but usually the accent appears over the stressed syllable. Melech at the beginning, malach at the end. That's one thing. That's the kind of easiest part. Most scholars, I think, agree that in some sense, the accents show how to divide the text into sense units. I deliberately put that pretty vaguely because I think that expressing it like that, almost everyone would agree that to some extent it shows where one unit of sense ends and the next unit begins.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by sense units? I mean, Nelson and I might know, but maybe the audience doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. Let me open up a Hebrew Bible here. In fact, since we were working from Genesis 1 just now, let's do so here.
To give another example of, you talked about accent. So, for example, the word Elohim that you read or you recited by heart, we know it's Elohim and not Elohim, right? Now, Elohim isn't a thing in Hebrew, so that's why your example was better, Melech and Malach. or katavti and katavti, right? Or vikatavti, right? There it actually completely does change the meaning. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, every word more or less in the Tiberian Bible has an accent, and those accents. I'm already running into problems here. We're trying to get an example of how the sense is broken up by the accents. Mm-hmm. So back to Genesis 1:1. According to the accents, I would read it like this in terms of sense. Bereshit, bara Elohim, et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So I broke it up. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we can kind of sense already intuitively in English how, I'm going to already be taking sides here, but how pausing or lengthening at certain points in the sentence just gives a very different sentence. So, for example, if I were to say, to learn Mazorah, you must study hard, then I would be saying something quite different to if I was speaking to let's say, a young lady called Mazorah, and let's say that there's a textbook that I'm saying that she has to study, and that textbook is written by a guy called Hard. So in that sense, I would say to learn Mazorah, you must study hard. Whatever I'm talking about, whatever field or discipline, let's say it's economics, Mazorah can only learn about this economics if she studies the textbook by Hard. So even there in those two example sentences, to learn Mazorah, you must study hard, and to learn Mazorah, you must study hard. We can see that the way that we pause, the way that we divide up the individual groups of words makes a difference to the meaning. So that is another aspect of what the accents do. And just finally, the accents as a third element, at least nowadays and for centuries, but we're not quite sure how far back it goes. But for centuries, we can say at the very least, the accents have also indicated the various melodies by which the biblical text is sung or is chanted, is cantilated. I'll pause there.
That's a great explanation. I want to bring an example. This is an example that the medieval commentators talk about, Deuteronomy 26:5. This is when the Israelite, there's a ceremony where you bring this basket of your tithe and you present it before God, and then it says Arami Oved Avi, which is always translated, I think, my father is a wandering Aramean. And so you actually have, now that I'm thinking about it, this is a mishpat shemani, a nominal sentence, right? Mm-hmm. So the word it actually doesn't even appear there, right? It's implied by the juxtaposition of these two nouns. So the way the accents divide that up famously is Arami Oved Avi. An Aramean destroys my father, or destroyed my father. And then the rabbis explain, well, who's the Aramean who destroyed my father? That is Laban, who tried to destroy Jacob. And which is like, what? No, this is talking about Abraham, who's the wandering Aramean. He came from Aram Naharaim, Aramea between the two rivers of Mesopotamia. But the accents actually seem to indicate a different interpretation of the phrase, that it's referring to Laban, who tried to destroy my ancestor, my father. And so there's an example where the accents are contrary to what we would expect the plain meaning to be. And maybe we're wrong, or the accents are taking a side against the plain meaning. That's possible too, right?
In that case, I think that the example of Laban was attempting to destroy Jacob is also represented in Targum Onkelos, if I remember correctly there.
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know for sure that's an early rabbinical midrash, and then it seems that the accents are giving the breakup of those three words in Hebrew, Arami Oved Avi, according to this midrashic interpretation rather than the pshat, and maybe that is the pshat and we're just wrong. I don't think so, but so it actually can affect interpretation. So, all right. So what was, and we've actually in previous SBL reactions talked about Sophia Pitcher's hypothesis, but I'd love to hear it from you. What I find so intriguing about it is, look, I gave a paper. I don't know that my paper is going to, well, maybe it will actually. I don't know. Most papers that you hear aren't going to fundamentally change the field if the hypothesis is accepted. Whereas if hers is accepted, this is a game changer. So tell us, what is her hypothesis now that you've explained the overall scholarly approach to the accents?
Well, okay, I should give a disclaimer that that Sophia is working from a very, very heavily linguistic framework, and that's pretty new to me. So I'm still very much trying to piece together my understanding, new word by new word. There is so much terminology in this field. As far as I understand, Sophia is using a linguistic model called prosodic phonology, which I had to look up. Yeah. And I think that all that means is that when we speak, we cluster words together, we use different speeds, we give different words different pauses, different stresses. Sometimes our voice goes up, sometimes our voice goes down, and all of those different elements, sometimes our voice goes up in pitch, sometimes our voice goes up in volume or down in volume, etc. So those are the kind of contours that we're very, very used to when we actually speak, but which linguists now study very, very formally and try to understand how is it cross-linguistically, so across different languages, how is it that pitch or volume or stress or pause or rhythm, how are they used? How do they all combine into the grand process of making sense of what somebody is saying? I think that is more or less prosodic phonology. And Sophia, if you're listening, forgive me, please, if I've got it completely wrong.
Well, she's promised to come on the program and explain her hypothesis, but the audience might not hear that for another year. So let's give so you're sharing the gist of it.
I'm sharing the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the big departure that she's presenting, really, from my perspective, is what she calls the continuous dichotomy theory or model, or I forget what she calls it exactly. Law of continuous dichotomy. There it is. LCD. And I was taught that at Hebrew University of Jerusalem as fact. Fact. And that this was common knowledge. Say common knowledge. The audience, not you guys. You could if you want. And she's coming along and saying, no, that's not correct. And what's so amazing to me is one of my teachers at Hebrew University, Simcha Kogut, he has 2 books on the accents. And in both of them, he's analyzing how the medieval commentators reacted to the accents, but all of his reactions assumed the law of continuous dichotomy. Well, now maybe we have to go back and look at what these medieval commentators said if the law of continuous dichotomy is wrong. Or more importantly, maybe it's still right, but maybe they didn't know about it. And we had this conversation as we were walking back from one of the lectures, Kim, about William Wicks. Yeah. And so she says, Sophia Pitcher says, William Wicks invented the law of continuous dichotomy. And when I heard that a few years ago, it blew my mind, because I thought that's just a fact. It's common knowledge. Ibn Ezra is engaging with the law of continuous dichotomy. And I forget who all the other rabbis were. Radak is engaging, these are examples from the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. But who says? Maybe they looked at the accents in a completely different way, and we don't necessarily know what that way is. Maybe they were wrong, but we can no longer take the law of continuous dichotomy for granted. To me, that's the biggest challenge of her research, whether she's right or not.
Yes. The more I dig into it, the more I think that actually lots of useful parts of what we learned with LCD can be maintained. Now, I think Sophia would want to push back against that and say, no, we need to have a whole new framework. But yes, in essence, what Sophia is saying is, look, we now know this prosodic phonology. We now have analysed how languages rise in intonation, fall in intonation, and in pitch, etc., etc. And actually, what the accents are doing is marking that for the reading of the biblical text, which is a very beautiful matching of a phenomenon that we see in the biblical text, in the Masoretic text, with the sort of phenomenon that linguists are studying from modern spoken languages. And to my mind, it's quite sort of intuitively plausible, because over the last 2-3 decades, I think one of the major strands of development of understanding within Masoretic studies in general is that the Masoretes really didn't make this stuff up. It's not that they sat down after the Talmud was finished and thought, right, okay, what are we going to do now? I know, let's get to work on the biblical text. It's not. And so what the Masoretes weren't doing was sitting down with a bare consonantal text and working out word by word, or which vowel should we put here, which accent should we put here. That's not what they were doing. They had received an oral tradition of the correct pronunciation, the correct reading of the biblical text, which had been preserved orally for centuries. And so what the Masoretes are doing towards the end of the first millennium is finding ways to write down what had been passed on to them orally, namely the correct way that the text should be read, the correct places where the text should be emphasized, the correct places where your voice should go up and should go down, and where you should pause. And what Sophia is saying, yeah, absolutely. And the accents are part of that big picture. I think that just makes really good.
Wow. This reminds me of like one of those, I forget his name, it's one of the 20th century physicists who came up with this like rule to explain like how like, I don't know, subatomic particles work. And he said the law knew more than I did, or the formula knew more than I did. Like he came up with this formula, and then he started to discover things based on his formula. And what you're saying is that, I think what she's saying is, I think what you're saying as well is that, what I was taught at Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the 90s was that, and I don't know if this was said explicitly, but it was kind of implied, that the Masoretes decided, okay, this is the middle of the verse, we'll put an nachta there. Now this is the middle of the first clause, we're going to put an accent here. Now this is the middle of the first half of the first clause, we'll put an accent there. And what Sophia seems to be saying, and I think what a lot of the work of Jeffrey Kahn and his students really bring out, is that they had this oral recitation, and these people are referred to in the Talmudic sources as Baalei Mikra, the masters of scripture, people who are reciting the scripture. And then you also had Tanaim, who were reciting the oral law, right? You had people who would recite these vast knowledges of information without necessarily understanding everything they were reciting. They just knew, here's where you put this word and here's how you pronounce that word. And then the Masoretes came along and said, how do we record this in graphic form? And that's where they might not have understood the linguistics behind it. They just knew, here's where your voice goes up, here's where your voice emphasizes, or here's where your voice kind of like has a trill, right? Like I'm thinking of the shalshelet, right? Assuming that's what it really is, right? Vayit mahamea, something like that, right? Where you're kind of pausing and really emphasizing that word. So they had these linguistic patterns that they recorded with graphic symbols, and this is why her explanation is so attractive. To do what scholars have told us for centuries, we don't need more than 5 or 6 symbols, right? You have 2 melechs, a mishneh, let me count my fingers. 2 melechs, you have 2 kesars, a melech, a mishneh, and a shalish. And then you have a conjunctive accent, and 6, and you're done. Maybe you add 1 more just for some disambiguation or something, right? We don't need all the numerous symbols that we have. So the explanation was, well, that's for cantillation, and we're not really interested in cantillation, right? That's what I was that's actually what I was taught at Hebrew University, right? Why do we have more than 6 or 7 symbols? Because that's for the cantillation. They're chanting it in the synagogue in some kind of stylized way. Okay, why are they doing that? So she says they're doing it because that's how people spoke. Wow.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that if I'm reading her correctly, then she's saying, look, this is a natural language phenomenon. That phrase comes up quite a lot. So to come back to what you were saying, this is not an artificial product. It's not, as you said, that the Masoretes sat down and said, okay, here's the half verse marker. It's that this has been preserved extraordinarily. This has been preserved since before the fall of the Second Temple. The way naturally that the text is read, perhaps in a stylized kind of a way, in a kind of very intentional, formal, stylized kind of way. But nonetheless, it is a natural language phenomenon, and therefore it should be accessible to be analyzed using the tools that we know from other natural languages. And that's exactly what Sophia is doing, as far as I can understand it.